Mixdown Media Productions.
Today on the Podcast Therapist, we're going to talk to you about whether or not you can run a podcast with just one person, or do you actually need two? And today is a reboot of the Podcast Therapist. I'll let you know exactly where I've been and how it might relate to you.
When you're one unbalanced piece of audio from losing your shit. This is the Podcast Therapist.
Hello, my friends. It is the Shannon radio broadcaster, podcaster, and podcast producer. And welcome back to another episode of the Podcast Therapist. And of course, I know I've been gone for a while. It's been a little difficult for me to get to this podcast, and I have missed it. I've missed building out content. I missed, putting YouTube videos up. But I think there's one thing that I really do miss is I really do miss building the content itself and being around people who I can help out. And so, just to kind of give you an idea of what has been going on, we'll dive into that here very shortly. But I've really made efforts to try to start making myself get back out there and, building content that actually matters for people. This podcast being one of them. Of course, adding in a video element is something that I think is that has always been on my mind. It has been on my mind for the last couple of years. And so what we're going to talk about today is really why I'm rebooting the podcast. And then we'll jump into another topic about hosting, podcast hosting. And these are questions that I see that are on the internet. This is the first question that I've wanted to go ahead and address. We'll try to keep it light and kind of keep it a little easy for people to digest. So let's talk about where I've been for the past, since 2021, I think is what it's been. 21, 22, something like that. I've been gone since 2021. And the last time I published any type of podcast, or I would say any type of content that was worth consuming, was in 2021 with this very podcast. And I was doing a very good job of creating podcasts and getting guests in and having people come in and talk to me about their podcast. But I felt as though that there was a focus problem that I had. The focus problem being that I felt as though I had to have a guest all the time. And, I know I didn't have to have a guest. And I think I kind of fell into a whole groupthink scenario where you read a lot of things online. You read a lot of people who do podcasts and they think they have to have a guest every week. And there's varying and differing opinions on whether or not you should have a guest on your podcast. And I think that was kind of a burden and overwhelming for me when it came down to, developing this podcast. And so I decided to go ahead and to kind of take a step back because I felt as though the systems that I was creating, they were not implemented very well. So one thing that I think that podcasters can relate to, and any type of content creator can relate to, is that there was a little bit of burnout, and I was burned out near the end of 2021. And in 2021 was just like, I just don't know what else to do. I feel as though my systems are failing on me. And when I talk about systems, I'm talking about the systems that I built to market the podcast, to get the podcast out there to different groups, to different areas. And even though I don't feel that the systems, I know that they weren't failing, but I think what failed was that I was overwhelming myself with the amount of work that I was doing. So that's where I think I failed, is I failed in implementing the right systems and handing off some of that work to some of the other people that I could help me out so that I could market the podcast out. And so as a result, it left me kind of empty. It left me, I don't know, I was running on empty all the time. And, I'm managing also working at a radio station at the same time at night. And so if you can imagine working at night, if you're not in your 20s or your 30s, if you're like me and you're in your 40s and you're working late nights, it becomes a little bit more of a drag. I mean, it's harder to do these things. So that's really kind of where I've been. So the skinny, well, I shouldn't say that's where I've been, but those are some of the elements of where I've been. But let's give you the skinny on where I have been. So while things were succeeding, like I told you, things felt jumbled, but I still kept a couple of clients on board. So those of you who were not aware, is that in addition to what I was doing with the podcast, this very podcast, the Podcast Therapist, and my YouTube channel, I was also editing podcasts for other people, and I was consulting other people about how to launch their podcast, how to make sure that their podcast is getting out in the marketplace. And some of those people have made efforts to continue, and others have, I don't know if they've necessarily forgotten about me, but I've always been around. And I've been working very consistently in terms of helping other people out. So one of those clients being the Guy Kawasaki Remarkable People podcast. And that's a podcast that we've been dealing with, or I've been dealing with since the end of 2019. And it was it actually came at the perfect time, because at the end of 2019, I was working in an agency for some extra money. And then my friend Jeff came to me and he told me, hey, do you want to help out editing this podcast for Guy Kawasaki? And I thought about it. I didn't ruminate over it, but I really thought about it, because I thought, oh, this is going to take a lot of time. Knowing what the nature of how podcast creation is for clients, it's done very manually. And I think that's how a lot of podcasters do it these days. They do it manually. Manually meaning they're editing in a software program such as Adobe Audition. They're doing it in Audacity, Logic Pro, whatever software you're using. It can be very manual. It can be time consuming. And so I really dreaded the fact that I would have to do that. But, I said yes, and I've been happy ever since. It's been such an amazing job and an opportunity to be able to edit the Guy Kawasaki podcast. So I've been doing that since 2019. And then, of course, when COVID came around, Guy continued to do his podcast, and I was able to continue editing his podcast. And here we are, November 19th of 2024, and I'm still happy to announce that I am still editing that podcast. But other things that kind of came into play was that I was having to fulfill obligations for the radio station. I was still having to do concerts, promotions, endorsements. Of course, in 2020, it was a little more difficult, because what we were trying to do is to try to generate some type of interest in online content for the radio station. And that was, as we all know, was a little bit difficult to do. So I wasn't able to do or succeed the way that I had hoped to succeed during COVID. But as we came out of COVID and came into like 2021 and 2022, I had been building content for the radio station for myself, and that's where I feel as though the burnout had happened. All right. So by the time 2023 came around, I was so burned out, but I was recommended to a new program that my friend Jeff had led me on to. And as any content creator is really, trying to do, is they're trying to earn some type of money, earn some type of cash, right? And he had told me about the Amazon Influencer Program. It was a brand new program at the time in 2022, I would say. And then, of course, by 21, I think it was by 2021, it was a pretty new program. And by 2022, I had enrolled in that program, and I started making review videos of products that I had already owned inside of my house. And so I went ahead and started making those videos on Amazon. So that helped me. That helped my situation financially. Now, I'm not going to say that I made millions on Amazon and made millions that allowed me to move. No, I would say that I made a significant amount of money within the Amazon Influencer Program to allow me to do the repairs on my car, to allow me to do upgrades inside of my condo, allow me to take the trips and go to conferences that I wanted to do. So I was still building the content out. And I think as we as podcasters burn out at certain points in time, we tend to step away, we stray away, we give up, we start something brand new. And that's exactly what I had done. We feel as though there's no success that we're seeing in the things that we are doing. But I can promise you that there is success as long as you're remaining consistent, which is something that I am still challenged by, is the consistency. So as I started to do the Amazon Influencer Program, I also discovered brand new equipment that was really make the podcast process a little easier for me. It would make it streamlined, by far a lot better. And that's when Rode decided to go ahead and release the Rodecaster Pro 2. And by no means, you're going to hear probably commercials in this podcast from this point forward, but this is not a commercial about the Rodecaster Pro 2. The Rodecaster Pro 2 was something that interested me because it was the closest thing that I could see as far as podcast pre-production that related very closely to what we were already doing at the radio station. And I thought to myself, I'm mind blown. Like, this is something that I really should look into. And so I made the efforts to continue to build out these videos on Amazon and earn the cash to build and buy myself a Rodecaster Pro 2. And that's very much what you can see when when I go to a commercial break or whatever, you'll be able to see that I have implemented that into my system setup right here on my podcast. So once I invested in the Rodecaster, I was able to build from scratch and build in pre-production systems that were capable of the Rodecaster Pro 2. I'm talking about bumpers, sweepers, anything that had to do with branding that I could deal with or that I could implement onto my Rodecaster Pro that was an audio brand that could be a part of my podcast so that you could remember the podcast upon hearing it for the first time. And I really, really try to drive that home with podcasters. I don't know if I've necessarily driven it home enough for podcasters. So as I started building that out and I started getting used to the Rodecaster Pro 2, life happened, right? Life happened, and I ended up joining my HOA board, which was something that I didn't want to do. But the community was starting to fall apart. We had a major shift in my HOA community where it was a green, lush community. And then the previous HOA board decided to remove all the trees from my community. And then we were just kind of left with a desert landscape. And it was not desert landscape like the way you would think. It was more of a desert landscape in terms of just dirt. It was just dirt. Open trenches, things like that. And it was horrible. And so myself and my neighbor upstairs decided to go ahead and join our HOA board. And that took up a lot of my time in terms of, making my living situation a little bit better, and took away the time that it would take to go ahead and build out a podcast or any type of content. So the refocus of the Podcast Therapist and my YouTube channel, this is something that has been on my mind for quite some time. I've wanted to go ahead and do it, and I've wanted to go ahead and build in something that I can help the community with, because my time with the HOA is still here. I'm still doing it, but it doesn't require as much of a time commitment. So I can now commit to the things that I really want to do. So here's what I'm planning on doing. Going into 2025, the focus in 2024 has been a little bit jumbled, and there have been personal things that have happened. But my refocus of the Podcast Therapist and my YouTube channel is about building content. And of course, it's about helping out the podcaster who is in the entrepreneurial space, who is a startup, who is, it's a solopreneur, it's a small business, or maybe you're a podcaster yourself where you're wanting to leverage your podcast into some type of business, but you're falling short in the areas in which you're trying to grow that podcast. That becomes a difficult thing. That is like the biggest complaint I see when I jump into forums online, whether I'm on Reddit or I'm now communicating more on Threads. I see it in Facebook groups all of the time. I want to be able to serve that segment of those people who are trying to turn their podcast into something that is relevant, that hits home with a specific audience. And I want to really break down the nuts and bolts of how we need to perceive or how we need to see our own podcast versus what you see in everyday news articles, what you see on YouTube, what you see on Spotify. You have to understand the perception of the type of podcast that you're creating. And sometimes you just don't necessarily need to do some of the things that those creators are doing. Maybe what you need to do is you need to simplify a few things. But we'll get into that in future episodes. I promise you we will get into that as well. So this is going to be something that I want to help podcasters create. I want them to notice that I'm building my own podcast because it is a clear resemblance of how radio works, the way that I do my podcast. How I do it is how it sounds on the radio. But what podcasters and what content creators don't realize is that the podcasting industry is really taking a lot of the cues from the radio industry, in which we have had implemented for many, many years. I mean, let's say at least 50 years. And those ideas have evolved over time. So those ideas being in marketing and promotion and growth, sponsorships, those are all things that have all become a part of the podcasting industry and have become, I guess you could say, part of the conversation a lot more often. You're hearing it more in conferences like Podcast Movement, Podfest. You're seeing it online. And yet, I don't think the average podcaster who has built a decent show hasn't figured out where to implement or how to implement those areas that we've been doing in radio since, I don't know, the dawn of broadcasting. But of course, you have to keep in mind, there has been an evolution of how these strategies and these tactics have been implemented in radio, and podcasting is just, they're just on the coattails of radio. So that's something that I really want to lean into. I want to lean into my expertise as a radio broadcaster, a 24-year radio broadcaster. I'm not saying that I know it all, but I am saying that I have an idea of how podcasters could be doing it. All right. So again, I'm going to be focusing on a segment of podcasters doing business, like entrepreneurs, side hustlers, small businesses, things like that. And I want to start helping podcasters focus on their systems, their audio systems. I want them to focus on their marketing systems. I want to focus on these areas because these are the areas, and it does not matter. It does not matter. I mean, there's only very, very, very few people doing this. But I want them to focus on the audio systems and the marketing systems to grow their podcast and to shave that time down that is spent on the cutting room floor, making it more difficult for them to publish content and be a part of their community as opposed to being a part of the editing program that they're chained to. I don't want that to happen to podcasters. So I've got written down here on my sheet, this is the goal that I have, not only just for myself, but the goal for you as the content creator, whether that be a YouTube content creator creating podcasts or a podcast content creator creating audio podcasts. That goal is to strategically and effectively grow your podcast by leveraging proven marketing and promotion techniques, attracting your ideal audience, building authority in your niche, and creating sustainable income streams that support your entrepreneurial journey. That sounds pretty ideal to me when you think about it. I would like to do these things for myself because I would like to practice what I preach when it comes down to developing a podcast. So that is just in a nutshell, a little bit about where I've been, where the podcast therapist has been, the struggles that I understand that you might be facing as a podcaster. And so I want to be able to try to decode that for you. So I see that there are people in the YouTube live right now that are commenting, and I promise you, if you stick around, I will answer your questions. I want to get through the program today, right now. We'll get to your questions here after a little while. I appreciate it, but you're welcome to go ahead and leave comments in the comment section while I am recording this and broadcasting this on YouTube Live. And I want to ask you one more question, or actually I don't want to ask you one more question. I want to let you know I'm actually on Threads. If you want to reach out to me on Threads, the link is going to be in the description after this broadcast, or it's going to be in the description of your podcatcher, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. And I want to ask you, how can I serve you? How can I serve you? And where are you stuck with your podcast? And where can I help you get unstuck? I'll be more than happy to answer those questions via Threads. Like I said, link is in the description. Coming up, we're going to be talking about whether or not you can run a podcast with one person only, or do you need two? That's coming up next on The Podcast Therapist.
The Podcast Therapist.
Launching a podcast can be overwhelming. You've got your equipment, a Zoom account, and a few episodes recorded, but what's next for a successful launch? The biggest mistake podcasters make is not having a proper launch sequence. Just like building a house requires a solid blueprint to ensure it stands strong, your podcast needs a strategic plan to enter the market successfully. Introducing the Podcast Launch Checklist, developed after helping numerous clients. This guide ensures your podcast launches launch is smooth and efficient. It's a 12-step sequence covering pre-launch, mid-launch, and post-launch phases with clear instructions to save you time and prevent mistakes. The checklist provides crucial pre-launch information and includes checklists to ensure nothing is missed. Plus, you'll get access to vetted resources, making your launch more efficient. Don't wander in the dark. Get the podcast launch checklist today and launch your podcast with confidence. Visit thepodcasttherapist.com/PLC to get 25% off this checklist.
Are you a small online business owner looking to get a head start in growing your email list and attracting new customers? You've got no time for guesswork. Hi there, I'm Nadia Solo, and I have been helping small business owners just like you with all things sales funnels and automations on Kajabi since 2020. Click on the link in the show notes to download my Lead Magnet Essential Checklist to find out about a proven 5x5 formula for creating lead magnets. Gain a solid understanding of what it takes to create your first next lead magnet and start seeing your email list skyrocket. Visit www.solositesolutions.com/TPT to download the checklist now. No more confusion, just practical steps to elevate your lead generation strategy.
Hey guys, it's Shannon, and when I decided I wanted to go ahead and start creating content all those years ago, I knew I needed a trusted website platform. I was managing multiple services, setting up API keys, and tracking all the costs became super overwhelming. Then I discovered Kajabi. Kajabi started helping out content creators like me and you sell courses, but they've grown into so much more than that. They're an all-in-one platform that lets you build a website, manage your email marketing, set up sales funnels, and of course, host all of your courses in one place. But they also allow you to host your podcasts, including paid or hidden ones for members who want to be a part of your own community. Plus, Kajabi offers an integrated community, just like Facebook groups, but within your own website. They give you detailed analytics and even a branded app. Using Kajabi has simplified my workflow and it's boosted my own productivity. If you want to learn more, you can use my affiliate link at thepodcasttherapist.com/Kajabi, or you can find the link in the show notes of your podcast player for this episode to go ahead and get started. Kajabi, it's the perfect tool to elevate your content creation and reach more people who are passionate about your work.
Mixdown. It's time for the Mixdown on the Podcast Therapist.
Thank you for tuning in for another episode of the Podcast Therapist, and welcome to the viewers who are watching on YouTube Live. Really appreciate you tuning in. If you're here, go ahead and say hello into the chat, and I'll try to respond back to you. We'll be responding to some of those comments near the end of the show, so I'd really love it if you stick around and just kind of hang out and enjoy the content that I'm sharing with you today. So, today I want to talk to you about a question that I had seen on Threads. I believe it was either on Threads or it was on Reddit, but I see this comment or this question come up quite a bit on social media platforms all the time. And the question is, can you run a podcast with just one person, or do you need two? I think actually this was a question that came out of a Facebook group. And so this seems to be a topic of conversation for people who are starting their podcasts out for the very first time. And they are just really kind of unsure, and they don't know exactly where they need to go ahead and start in terms of, I guess, I don't know, do they need to do they have to do a solo podcast, or do they need to actually have a guest? And so we're going to go ahead and break those down for you. We'll break down what each one looks like, and then I guess kind of what the benefits are of each one of those areas. So we'll talk about solo podcasts, solos with special guests. So it'd be like what you typically see online. It'd be like you doing the hosting, and then you invite a guest every single week. And then we'll talk about the co-host dynamic that exists there. So we're not going to do anything too heavy today. We're just going to go ahead and break it down. And of course, this episode, or at least this segment, can really help podcasters who are really on the fence in terms of like whether or not they need to move to solo or if they need to stay with guests. So we'll just go ahead and get started there. So let's go ahead and get started with, of course, the solo podcast format. And that's the one that I'm doing right now, the one that you hear, the one that you're hopefully enjoying on your ride. Okay, so let's talk about some of the things that you would get with a solo podcast. First of all, you're getting the flexibility with the scheduling. So there's nothing better than to do a solo podcast than to do it on your time whenever you want. Some things that I think that you need to take into account, though, is that if you are doing a solo podcast and you are doing a live recording of your solo podcast, that means you are kind of chaining yourself to a specific time. The consistency effort of doing a solo podcast really it has flexibility, but if you're doing it live through a recording, then it becomes something where you are chained to the desk and you're having to do that consistently every week, or I don't know, maybe every day. If you're doing a podcast every day, you're having to do it every single week at the same time and bringing people in, and they're watching the podcast or they're listening to the podcast, at least watching the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, or LinkedIn, wherever. No, I don't think it's Spotify, but at least on LinkedIn, where you can live stream all of this stuff if you're using a software like Ecamm. So yeah, you get a great flexibility with that. You also get really great creative control. I mean, think about how many times you have been able to watch another podcast or listen to another podcast, and you are able to hear the creativity of that particular podcast. You decide what the type of tone it is, the pacing, the direction of the content, where you want to go with that podcast. So when you're doing solo podcasts, the creative control can be very, very liberating. And of course, there's this personal brand building that you have when you're doing a solo podcast. People get to understand you. They get to know you. They get to like you. One of the things that happened for me when I was building out my YouTube channel was that people got to see that I was just doing it on my own, and it built out my own brand right here on YouTube. And those of you who are listening on a podcast, that's what ended up happening, is that people got to know who I was. Of course, it helps a little bit, right? Some of the personal branding does help with the fact that I have long hair. Today, not long hair. I've got it up in a man bun, but I got long hair, I got a beard, it's just one of those things where I have a little bit of more of a recognizable face, but it doesn't mean that I have this unique face. I mean, there's plenty of other podcasters out there that are doing it just as well, and they're getting just as many people who are tuning in live to them or listening to them. So you get to build out your personal brand in so many different areas, whether that be your voice or your expertise, not just saying that it's your looks, but your voice and your expertise is really going to make that impact within your niche. And of course, doing a solo podcast, it really makes you feel as though you're right there talking to someone. You're in their ear. You are advising them on information in which they might be struggling, right? And so I think that is one of the best things about doing a solo podcast, is that I can sit here and I can tell you, hey, this is what I would really work on in terms of your podcast. Have you set up your website appropriately? How simple or how simplified is your website? So those are things that would really make an impact. It makes you feel as though you are being listened to by the host. So those are just some of the things that you can kind of look forward to by doing a solo podcast. And you would have to make that decision whether or not you do it on your own or not. Next, we're going to go ahead and talk about the solo podcast, but it's a solo podcast with a guest. So it's not necessarily solo, right? It's like you're inviting a guest. My good friend Andy Lyons talks about this, or she does a podcast where she always has a guest come in, and it's someone that talks about their specific expertise, right? So a solo podcast with a special guest every single week can be beneficial and useful. So what are some of the things that come with doing a solo with guest, right? So you get a fresh perspective, you get some expertise from some people that you invite on the show, and it really helps not only build their authority, but it helps you build your authority as well, because you know these people, you have communicated with them. The new insights, the expertise, the experiences, they will add a little bit more color. They'll add some more depth to your podcast. So when you start inviting guests, it adds more depth. I mean, I'll definitely have guests on my podcast, but there are going to be times where I do just solo podcast and I'm just sharing my thoughts out, whether that be news or whether that be a hot topic of the day. I don't know what that could be, but that's really what I have decided to do. I want to go ahead and bring in some special guests. Some of the things that come with inviting special guests are the networking opportunities. This is something that I not only know that has been very beneficial to me in the past, but I know it works because of the podcast that I edit with my friend Jeff, and of course we do it with Guy Kawasaki, is that the networking opportunities are by far the best things that you can do whenever you're doing special guest interviews. You expand your circle, right? Of course, you introduce yourself, or you introduce that guest to your episode, and then of course in return they introduce you to their audience. And that's one of the cool things about bringing a guest on, because you're kind of mutually sharing those audiences and getting to know, they're getting to know who you are, and it builds some form of authority. All right. Some other things that you might look to whenever you're doing a special guest episode would be I'm sorry, let me take that back. There's going to be no editing in my podcast. I'll tell you that right now, because this is like doing like live radio, right? But let's talk about this. All right, doing a solo podcast with special guests, you get the variety, and the variety keeps the content engaging, right? So when you're alternating between the conversation between you and your guest, the conversation becomes more engaging, and it's kind of a mix of consistency and novelty. It depends on how you want to look at it, right? I've definitely invited people on a podcast, or I've interviewed people on the radio, and the dynamic is a little bit different. Maybe you're able to joke a little bit. You have to understand what your objective is, really, when it comes down to your interview, your guest that you're interviewing, and how far you can really take the interview, how far you want to get personal, how far you want to become more businesslike. I mean, the variety really keeps that content engaging. And then, of course, you could do something like an episode-specific collaboration with your guest if you wanted to. So you could tailor a guest appearance around specific topics, have a series that you're talking about where there's be a tech series that you're talking about, and that collaboration, you can keep bringing them in every week, and for like, say, 3 weeks, and they're doing just like a tech series. And that tech series talks about about the latest in tech and software and hardware, something like that. So think about collaborations that you can do that are relevant to the trends in your niche, and that might help you out. And of course, the last type of podcast hosting, or I guess dynamic, that you could implement here would be the co-host with guests. So what do I mean by co-host and guests? This means that, let's say it's just you and your buddy, your best friend or your girlfriend, and you guys are on the same page as far as starting a podcast. You see this a lot, right? This is like kind of the thing now these days. It's you with a buddy or you with a girlfriend, and you're doing a podcast together, and you have the same objective for your podcast, but you add in the element of bringing in a guest that you can interview. And this makes it a lot more fun, right? I've seen there's so many podcasts and video podcasts out there that do this, right? That it has become kind of the norm in the industry. And so what are some of the benefits that you get from this is that you get kind of some balanced energy, right? Some balanced energy, a little bit more banter. The banter is a lot more fun. That's the best part about doing some of those types of interviews, is that to get the banter. If you have you and your co-host, and then of course you have a guest, that's like morning show radio, if you ask me. It's such a different dynamic, and it just reduces pressure on just having one person holding the conversation for one specific hour or 2 specific hours. And so if you have a co-host, there can be that dynamic banter that really makes it a little more appealing to the ear, and people are a little more entertained when it comes down to listening to your podcast. Another benefit would be is that you get a different viewpoint from your guest. Diverse viewpoints really make for great discussions, right? So if you can bring someone else in with you and your buddy, and they can offer a different perspective without you getting angry about anything. I mean, I think we can all say that within 2024 and the podcasts that exist in the marketplace to this day, whether it relates to politics, and I don't get into politics about my podcast, but we did see a lot of that. There were different perspectives that came in from whether you were on one side or the other. The different perspectives really added a dynamic to how your podcast was going to, I guess, be perceived, right? So having those different viewpoints really, really engages the listeners. Are they going to fight? Are they going to argue? Or is the arguing that they're doing right now, what are they going to do? Are they going to actually publish that? Those are things that I think really make a podcast kind of cool. Another benefit of having a co-host podcast with a guest is that you get a little bit more of a flow with your interviews. You can have maybe your co-host asking questions while you are the one that is handling all the sound effects, or vice versa. I don't know how it would look. Or maybe what you're doing is that you have one person that's ensuring that the interview is getting off the ground the right way. The discussions are a little more rich, right? So we're just kind of thinking about that when it comes down to the interview flow, where one person maybe deals with the tech and the other person is dealing with the questions. I did a podcast many, many years ago, probably about 12, 15 years ago, called The 20-Minute Podcast. And it was with my friend Jimmy, who was a radio station DJ that worked there at the time. He had been full-time at one point in time, left, and then he came back to do part-time. And then what happened was that we were like, we want to start a podcast. This is like, I'd say like 2012. And we wanted to go ahead and create a podcast that sounded like radio and that had segments, entertaining segments. And I mean, you got to keep in mind that when we did that podcast, it was really trying to push the envelope of like what we can say, right? It was like, what can we say on this podcast? Because we were limited on the radio to what we could say. And when I say it wasn't necessarily, I guess you could say it was about content, but on the radio, you're obviously regulated by the FCC. So you can't really get too deep into the weeds about controversial topics, cussing, all those types of things, right? You can't do those things on radio. So when we decided to start the 20-minute podcast, we wanted to push the envelope and push it to the edge. And we did. The reason that podcast does not exist to this day was the day when I decided that I wanted to go ahead and start teaching people how to not only build websites for their podcast, how to build out their podcast, what equipment they can use. I was trying to recreate what I was doing at a radio station with mixing boards and software there, and doing it kind of like, I wouldn't say it's like a duct tape style podcast, right? But I was trying to allow people to say, okay, you can do these things that shave the editing time down in your editing software by implementing the pre-production pieces on your mixing board, and you don't have to do as much editing. And sometimes I think that when podcasters see stuff like that, they feel as though they need to edit, like as a rite of passage. They got to spend over an hour, 2 hours inside of their DAW just so they can edit an episode, right? And I just don't think that that's what your time should be spent doing. Your time should be spent building the podcast, publishing it, thinking of it like radio, right? Once it's out on the radio airwaves, it's done, right? The only difference is that you're doing a podcast, it is recorded, and then it is published and it's there for everyone to see. But I eliminate the fact that it's for everyone there to see. But you're just letting it go out into the public. You're getting it out there, and you're moving forward, and you're recording a brand new episode. So when it comes down to co-hosts with guests in the style of podcast that you're doing, you have these three elements that are of benefit. You get balanced energy and banter. You get diverse viewpoints. You have improved interview flow. And then, of course, when you have a guest that comes in, you have chemistry. Sometimes that chemistry can be really, really great. If you have really great chemistry, you bring in a comedian, or maybe you bring in an expert, a psychologist. I don't know. Maybe that chemistry is a lot better, right? And that chemistry with your co-host, it can create even more dynamic conversations so that listeners want to come back. Even, without guests, maybe your dynamic between your co-host is so good that you have this chemistry that really, really pops, and it makes for a far more engaging podcast. So that's just something to kind of think about. We have, to recap here, we have solo podcast formats, solo with guests, and co-hosts with guests. All right. And each one has a benefit for you whenever you're developing this, whether you're already in the journey itself or you're getting ready to start. It doesn't matter. Perhaps you have a co-host that you're like, they're not as committed as I am. I'm just going to go solo. You don't have to crowdsource this. You don't have to crowdsource it at all on anything. Oops, sorry about that. I got some music running here. You don't have to crowdsource this at all with anyone. You can just start doing it yourself. Make the decision. Do you want to go solo, or do you want to have a co-host with yourself? Or do you want to go solo and have a guest? Just make the decision. You don't have to second guess yourself. Just go out and do it. So coming up, we are going to be talking about a couple of events, and I'm going to be answering some questions that have shown up in the YouTube live chat. So thank you for joining right here on YouTube Live. I'm more than happy to see you here. This is, of course, obviously my maiden voyage in live video streaming for my podcast. So I appreciate you guys being here and sharing this time with me. I know you guys have busy schedules. So again, like I said, we'll have some final thoughts. We'll talk about a couple of events coming up here very, very soon, and we'll answer your questions here very shortly. You're listening to The Podcast Therapist.
podcast therapist.
Hey, what's up? It's Shannon. And if you're tired of spending too much time and money on podcast transcriptions, let me tell you about Descript. Now, before Descript, I spent a fortune on other services to transcribe my 40-minute to hour-long podcast and even some of my YouTube videos. But now I just upload my audio to Descript and it handles the rest. The transcriptions are super accurate and they capture every word. The app even lets me remove the filler words so my transcriptions can look clean and professional on my website for the transcription section. And Descript is also a game changer for video content. After recording, Descript provides a transcript of your audio, and then you can edit your audio just by editing the text. Simple cut, copy, and paste just to make precise edits. I'll take it. You don't even need advanced audio editing skills for this. Plus, Descript has all kinds of other amazing features like eye correction for video, creating audiograms for social media, the overdub feature for making corrections, and real-time collaboration if you have a team. So stop wasting time and money on other services. Check out Descript at my affiliate link at thepodcasttherapist.com/getdescript. Or if you can't remember the address, check the link in the show notes of your podcast player for this episode. Give it a try. You'll see how Descript will change the way you create podcasts and videos.
Are you ready to master the art of podcast interviews? Introducing Mastering Podcast Interviews by Shannon Hernandez, a comprehensive ebook designed to help you conduct exceptional interviews from preparation to promotion. Whether you're just starting out or looking to refine your skills, this ebook provides practical advice, tips, and techniques to enhance your interviewing prowess. Learn how to set clear objectives, research your guests, and craft engaging questions that resonate with your audience. With over 20 years of experience in the radio industry, Shannon Hernandez shares his insights on building rapport, maintaining conversation flow, and ensuring a smooth post-production process. This ebook also includes essential checklists and reflective prompts to help you continuously improve. Don't leave your interviews to chance. Use Mastering Podcast Interviews to elevate your podcasting game and create compelling content that stands out. Get your copy today and it will be delivered to your inbox immediately. Visit thepodcasttherapist.com/interviews to get your copy now and start mastering your podcast interviews.
Hey, what's up? It's Shannon, and if you're looking to step up your podcasting game, let me tell you about the Rodecaster Pro 2. Now, this is the closest thing to a professional radio soundboard that I've ever seen, and I absolutely love it. There's so many great features with this mixing board that you can virtually do anything on it. Now, some of my favorite features include the fact that you can record directly on a micro SD card that goes directly into the unit, and then, of course, when you're done recording your podcast, you get a fully produced podcast ready to go, ready to publish. And if you really want to refine or fine-tune your audio, the Rodecaster Pro will also capture on the SD card individual tracks so that you can refine them in your own DAW. And smart pads, they are the game changer for me. Coming from radio, I use something very similar at the radio station. And this way I can load all my sound effects, intros, bumpers, all onto the Rodecaster Pro 2. It's like having my own mini radio station here at home. Seriously, the Rodecaster Pro 2 has transformed my podcasting. Don't take my word for it. Experience it for yourself. You can head on over to thepodcasttherapist.com/RCP2, like the number 2, or check the show notes of this podcast in your podcast player for the link. Take your podcast to the next level with the Rodecaster Pro 2 and see how it can revolutionize your podcasting journey.
Hey there, podcast lovers. Do you ever find yourself at a crossroads struggling with life's big decisions? I'm Adam, and I know exactly how you feel. I've been there, faced with overwhelming choices and uncertainty, not knowing where to turn or who to trust. That's why I created the Decision Hour, a podcast designed to guide you through life's toughest choices. In the Decision Hour, we dive deep into real life stories, offering expert advice and practical tips to help you make those tough choices with confidence. But that's not all. We also feature interviews with inspiring individuals who have faced similar challenges and have come out stronger. Plus, you get to access our exclusive community, where you can share your experiences, get support, and connect with like-minded people. So if you're ready to take control of your life and make decisions that truly matter, tune in to The Decision Hour. Visit our website at thedecisionhour.com to start your journey today. Remember, the power to make great decisions is just one click away.
Welcome back to the Podcast Therapist. I want to thank everyone who is tuned in on YouTube Live right now. If you're watching this live, if you are listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please don't forget to go ahead and follow the show. Follow me on The Podcast Therapist. I'll be publishing more of these episodes for you guys to go ahead and consume. And of course, if you're looking to start out a podcast and you're trying to figure out which type of equipment that is right for you, maybe everyone's got a different setup, right? I want you to check out my essential equipment guide to starting up a podcast, which you can find at thepodcasttherapist.com/quickstart. The link for that is in the show notes down below, and we'll be able to help you out there. And hopefully I'll be able to communicate with you, email with you. I do get back to emails, so that is just something that I think that that you have to do when you're trying to serve other people. So so I want to thank all of you guys for being here. Now, if you have questions, we're going to be answering questions here very shortly that are coming in from the YouTube live stream. Just a couple. Maybe I'll just be addressing a couple of comments themselves. I really appreciate it. So you can leave your comment down in the section below, and we'll try to get to that before we go ahead and log off. But I want to remind you guys, or actually I want to let you guys know of an event that is happening coming up on September 12th at 12 noon Mountain Standard Time. It's going to be an event called a YouTube podcasting event. And of course, this is going to be the global head of podcasting and podcasting production lead. I'm sorry, take that back. The podcasting product lead. They're going to be speaking about leveling up your podcasting game and maybe some updates. I got something in my eye. I'm sorry about that. I'm trying to read it right now. I got something going on. My glasses are preventing me from reading it. So again, let me say that one more time. A YouTube podcasting event happening on December 12th at 12 noon p.m. Mountain Standard Time. If you're trying to step up your game in terms of podcasting on YouTube, you might want to check this out. It might have some updates. I can kind of give you an idea of what you need to do on YouTube for your podcast, but they might give a few more hints and tips and tricks that you can utilize for your podcast as far as YouTube is concerned. I'm just going to tell you this right now, as far as someone who published on YouTube and was utilizing and using tools that allowed me to get my videos out there a little bit more, is that I was using tools like TubeBuddy. I mean, those were the tools that really helped me out as far as the publishing of my podcast. I think we have to remember, and I don't know, I can't say that I'm the exact perfect expert on this, but I'm going to guess that the SEO is just as important for your YouTube podcast as it is when you're putting something up on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That is going to be huge. So I think that's something that you should really kind of consider. So again, one last hit on that. The YouTube podcasting event happening December 12th at 12 noon Mountain Standard Time. I'll go ahead and leave a link in the description below. So let's go ahead and do this. I forgot to go ahead and I got to put myself on the screen here, but we're going to go ahead and answer a couple questions that are in the chat, or just maybe address a few comments that are in the chat right now. And I want to go ahead and address this one from Chris Stone, who's gone ahead and shown up into the live feed. Thank you so much for showing up. I appreciate it, Chris. Chris says, great sounding ads, man. You have done those a few times. So yeah, this podcast is going to have ads. I don't care what the experts say, what others in the space say. This is how I want to go ahead and do the ads. Because they definitely benefit you. They benefit me. It's a mutual for myself and for you. So if there's something that I see that would be beneficial for you, don't think that there's not going to be some type of ad that is going to be in there too. But there is also a deeper strategy with the ad that I've thought about many times. I've seen it a few times. I've seen it done successfully a few times, and it just works. It just works every single time. So you're probably going to hear more ads in this, and you're more than welcome to fast forward through them. I don't care. I don't mind. One of the things we get at the radio station when someone doesn't like a song is they say like, oh, I don't like that particular Falling in Reverse song. And then my response is, and it's not for me to be like a complete jerk, but it's like, if you don't like the song, change the radio station. Like we're not forcing you to listen to the radio station. Go and listen to another radio station, but you're always welcome to saunter on back and listen to us if you don't like that song. So anyway, so yeah, I'm going to keep doing more ads on this podcast. That's how it's going to be. So I'm going to get to a couple other questions here. Let's see here if I can answer this one. I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer it the best that I can, but from Mrs. Buddha, she says, Shannon, we are trying to create a network channel on YouTube, and I want to bring contributors. How is the proper way to go about it? So I'm not too sure or clear on this particular question in terms of a network channel. Are you talking about building one channel and then other people come in and they record on that one channel itself? Is that what you're talking about? If you're going to do that, I would suggest that, you have an overall general, password that, or ability to give someone access to that YouTube channel. I don't know if that's an ability. I thought it was in the past, but you can give people access to a YouTube channel, I believe, on the back end of YouTube, and they can go ahead and contribute to that channel itself. Let me research that a little bit more, and I'll get back to you on that answer, or I'll give you an answer on that real quick. And of course, we'll do another question here from Chris Stone. He says, if someone wants to start a podcast and has a smaller budget, what are some of the things you would suggest they invest in? Well, I would definitely invest in something at least like a Focusrite. I would need something more along the lines, as far as, let's say, tech, right? You're going to need some tech. So you need at least a Focusrite with a solid microphone. And then on top of that, the software that you're going to need, as far as hosting is concerned, you're going to need some type of hosting provider such as Buzzsprout. You can have many different hosting providers that are out there. There's Blueberry, there's Buzzsprout, there's Simplecast. I mean, the numbers of them just kind of go on and on. I mean, now seems like there's 1,000 hosting providers that exist out there, and that's going to be the one thing that you're going to need. I know a lot of people will say they want to use something. I think it's Spotify for podcasters, where they give you free hosting. That I don't want to talk bad about anyone really, but I've never had a great relationship with Spotify for podcasters, which used to be Anchor.fm. And I recommended people against using Anchor FM because they always found problems with whether their uploads were being published or whether or not their uploads were showing up inside of a platform. So I would just stay away from that. I would say that consider investing a minimal amount of money. You'll need at least the microphone. You'll need at least the hosting provider. And then if you want to go ahead and you want to get something like, say, Riverside, that might help you out in terms of bringing guests in. So those would be at least the three things that I would invest in if I'm on a tight budget. But again, my Essential Equipment Guide, it shares a lot of that inside of the guide, which you can find in the link description down below of this podcast episode itself. So great question, Chris. I really appreciate that. And as for doing this podcast, I want to thank you guys so much for tuning in. Those of you who are on those YouTube live stream, I'm going to continue to keep streaming live, but we are going to go ahead and call it a day. It has been fun. It's been great to be here recording my first podcast reboot live on YouTube. It feels good. I have a few things I need to work on and try to work on them on the video side. But I think that as long as you're giving some type of effort with your podcast and you're willing to try and you're willing to accept the mistakes, it only leaves room for you to become a lot better. So remember that when you go into your next podcast recording. Until next time, this is Shannon Hernandez on The Podcast Therapist. We'll see you then.